I've now increased my default rate, which used to be 1.3, and then now it's 1.5 for everybody. And then obviously the worst is Shapiro, because he's on 1.5. It's like 5 times the normal person talking.
One of my friends drove cross country in college, and he was just listening to podcasts the whole way. And he did that. Like, he ratcheted up his speed until, like, by the end of the trip, he was listening to everything at 2.0 speed.
Yeah. I can listen to some things at 2 times speed, but they have to be much slower talkers. Like, hardcore history I could do on 2 times speed.
Yeah.
But I don't think there's any way that you could do Shapiro, because, like, here, I'll show you what it sounds like. It's pretty funny, actually. Shapiro is obviously, like, by far the worst.
President Trump threatens to run with fire and fury the long-awaited FISA warrant application against Carter Page's release, sort of, and President Trump's poll numbers
This is
still
1.5.
Ben Shapiro, this is the Ben Shapiro Show.
And then here's 2.
Boy, we have a lot to get to today, and we will get to all of it. But first, I want to remind you, if you want the best watches in the business,
Yeah, I don't know. That just sounds like Ben Shapiro to me.
This company has grown like crazy now. Almost 2 million watches sold in the United States. Revolutionized fashion. I believe it's fashion. I know movements like this. I have movement sunglasses. I have 2 movement watches. My wife has 2 movement watches. My parents have movement watches. Everybody on the studio has movement watches.
I mean, I can kind of follow it.
They're just terrific. Go check it out right now. Movement watches are all about looking good and keeping it simple. They have sunglasses and fashion for bracelets for her as well. They don't just tell you.
But then now, after I listen to it fast and I slow it down, it sounds like really slow. Like,
movement watches start at just $95 at an department store. You're looking at $400 to $500.
So slow. Okay, anyway.
And retail markup, providing the best possible prices.
His ad reads are fucking hilarious.
Hello again. Welcome to Grokking Points. I'm Travis.
I'm Alex.
What's going on, Alex?
There's a bunch going on right now, at least if you count what's going on in the realm of Twitter. There's a bunch of...
Why wouldn't you count that?
that's how we measure
the
reality.
The most important political dialogues happen there.
Yeah, number of retweets is the new like number of casualties in war or something. we don't even have these figures anymore. That's a real thing, right? Because like you see occasionally people will bring up statistics about so many things in the world are getting better because half as many infants have died this year than died 10 years ago, or rates of crime and violence are going down, and wages and life expectancy is going up, all these things. And then at the end of the day, most of the time you really are concerned with how many retweets you're getting, or like how big was the latest Trump scandal or something like that.
Yeah. Late stage capitalism.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. Well, that's relevant because there's a couple things that I wanted to talk about this week. There was Russ Roberts from Econ Talk did a really long episode talking about the effect of media on culture, and obviously this has been a huge conversation. Sam Harris has also sort of talked about this with the effects of globalism on the world right now, and a lot of people are Arthur Brooks and what's his name?
Ezra Klein.
Thank you. Arthur Brooks and Ezra Klein from Vox Media have been talking about how to have conversations in the modern age. And Arthur Brooks is he was the former president of AEI. He's going to be stepping down, and he's starting his own podcast about trying to bridge the cultural divide in the U.S. There's also a Intelligence Squared debate, that's one of my favorite podcasts recently, about is social media good for democracy? And I thought that was interesting. And then, of course, all the normal Trump stuff, like Trump has a brand new scandal about this meeting that he had with Putin, and some comments he's made about NATO.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about Trump, and especially Trump and Putin, I think, in the second segment.
And then lastly, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who now everyone is abbreviating as AOC because no one can pronounce her name. She had a recent appearance on Firing Line, which I think is worth going into.
What is that show?
Firing Line?
Yeah.
Well, it's this older. I think it started in the 80s or something, like early 80s or maybe even 70s, and it was just a political talk show where it was usually there. I think it started with William Buckley, who was like a kind of agro neocon back in the day, who was really good at asking like pointed interview questions. And so he would bring on political guests or popular figures like Muhammad Ali and just talk about politics and culture and whatnot.
What network is it on? Oh, it's on PBS.
Oh, okay, cool. They've actually had previous guests who were socialists or like talking about socialism back in the Cold War days, and so they referenced that in the Ocasio-Cortez episode. But regardless, so she was on that show, and then there's a bunch of hubbub on Twitter about that. Oh, and then one more thing. there's some conversations about James Gunn being fired from Disney, and various edgy comedians being pointed out that they had offensive tweets in the past. So we can go into that. What about you, Travis? What's on your radar?
I also listened to that Sam Harris show with Ian Bremmer. I also wanted to bring up this 538 show from July 23rd, where they go really into kind of what the role of the Democratic Socialist wing of the Democratic Party is, and like how we should think about the Democratic Party now, and like where it's heading, and what socialism means to the Democratic Party, and all of these things. It's a really good show.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. Okay, so
Okay, well let's talk about the first thing. What did you just mention?
well, the main topic that I see that's going on right now is what is the status of social media in democracy? This came up a few months ago when Mark Zuckerberg went in front of the Senate, or the Senate and went in front of Congress and testified, and they basically grilled him on a bunch of questions about Facebook and to what extent they were censoring. Some people thought that they were censoring conservative voices. Some people thought that they were complicit or negligent in Russia's involvement in trying to influence the election in Trump's favor. So sort of both sides are mad at Facebook right now, and everyone has this love-hate relationship with it, where like everyone wants to shit talk on it, and it's just common knowledge, like, yeah, Facebook's terrible, Twitter's terrible, but also, we can't stop using these platforms.
Yeah.
And we have, we have some actual reasons why we think that they're good, and so that that's the basis for the debate, obviously.
Yeah, and I mean, even if the management of these platforms was totally optimal, even if we could all agree about how they should be managed, what should be filtered, like who should be banned, that kind of thing, we still have this conversation about what the role of social media isn't, as in like we've never been able to talk to each other like this, and that's a lot of people are pointing out that as probably the reason why we're so divisive right now. Yeah, we kind of have to figure out whether these kind of platforms are going to be the savior of our democracy or its downfall.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess there's a question there of how you view technology in general, because I think what we've seen throughout history is, obviously there's some technologies that are particularly destructive, but for the most part, usually there's a new technology and there's some sort of like social agitation around the unrest that technology creates, because it has changed, it changes the economy, it changes the culture. And then at some point afterwards, things are just better and everyone's like, oh yeah, that was great. I mean, I forgot who it was exactly. Maybe this was in the Intelligence Squared debate. Somebody brought up the point that back when the printing press was first starting to be a thing, people were really concerned about it. They were like, oh no, if it's basically the same concerns now. If you can easily disseminate information, people will spread like false information. People will organize in a way that is, it's just going to be purely populist and destructive, and it'll erode like our social norms and stuff, and people will start, they'll be able to distribute porn and stuff that questions the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, this is a trope that's been going on for centuries. Socrates said that he never wrote anything down because he thought writing made the brain weak. Like you don't have to remember anything anymore because you can just write it down. Like, wow, you're like a lesser mind for doing so.
Yeah, that's an interesting notion, because there actually is some amount of truth to that. Like, I think any time that you utilize technology, you're reducing your own self-reliance in a certain way. Like, none of us know how to hunt anymore. And if we were put into a situation where you have to hunt, yeah, maybe that screws you up a bit. But obviously we accept that trade-off because we'd rather have the extra time to not have to hunt, and we can just go to the grocery store and buy our slabs of meat and
I'd rather
and whatever.
Yeah, I'd rather use my brain in for the things that humans are good at, and not for the things that humans are bad at. Like, we're just so bad at multiplying numbers in our head. Why would I even use my brain? Like, why would I dedicate a bunch of time to learn how to multiply 4-digit numbers together in my head when I can utilize technology for that?
Right. So bringing that into the social media conversation. So I think the main points, there's a Socrates type side, which is like technology in itself. It sort of weakens you as an individual. It makes you, maybe the analogy to social media is you can outsource your ideas and your opinions to other people. So you can sort of just take on, like, the way that you think could start to be just reflective of whatever filter bubble that you're inside of or echo chamber. And so that's the risk that maybe Socrates might see in social media is, people aren't thinking for themselves anymore because they're outsourcing their thoughts to like the hive mind. But then on the other hand, you can say there's so much more information out there and so many different perspectives. The higher the peak of information that you could gather is much higher. And so if you were adept at synthesizing all these different types of information together, and if you can, maybe develop that skill individually and culturally over time, then you'll end up being a more competent person. So I'm sure we remember when we were early on the internet and we didn't know how to like avoid getting viruses or going to spammy websites, or we couldn't quite tell if somebody was trolling or they're being serious. And then maybe 10 years into it, you figure those things out and you figure out how to not like post awkward cringy stuff on Facebook, and you basically avoid the traps that as a new technology you didn't quite notice it. So what is your take on that? Do you think that's where we're going, or do you think that this is something that I don't know, maybe as humans we're just inherently not capable of grappling with?
Yeah, well, it's such a different space. Like the introduction of anonymity, we've created communities now that have never existed in any form in human history, where people can get together having nothing in common geographically, but everything in common cognitively or culturally or what have you. And the anonymity just kind of ratchets up everything, because like instead of in a real life circumstance where what comes out of your mouth is kind of the last thing that you think, like you have a filter and you kind of filter out what you're gonna say according to the social circumstances. On these communities, it's like the first thing that comes to your brain. So that's just never been a thing before in human history. And we just have to figure out how to deal with that. I don't know if we can. I don't know if we have the ability to figure that out, but we can't avoid having a conversation with each other now because we're so connected. So we have to figure out how to have that conversation, because if we don't figure out, then there's nothing left. Like the only other option is civil war.
Sure. I saw someone mention on Twitter earlier that one possible, if someone was responding to Jack, Jack, the CEO of Twitter, often tweets about, problems with social media, and he's self-aware about these sorts of things. And somebody responded to one of his tweets saying, you should just change Twitter so that you're not allowed to be anonymous anymore. Like just ban anonymous accounts basically. And I guess this is kind of what Facebook did, is they forced you to tie your account in with your identity and get verified that way. I think Scott Adams responded to that, which is why I saw it on Twitter. And he said that, the reason that they don't do that is because it would hurt Twitter's bottom line, or like it would reduce engagement with the platform, basically. So I'm curious about that. I mean, obviously there is some financial incentive there to keep more people engaged, but I'm not sure that that's a bad thing. Like, to your point about if you're anonymous, you can just sort of say the first thing that comes to your mind instead of paying attention to the social norms. Some people would argue that's a good thing, because there could be something important that you want or have to say, but then you're sort of being in some way softly oppressed by your culture, that you feel that if you had said this with your friends or family, that you'd be shamed or that you'd be looked down upon. And then now we're sort of circumventing that, and you have a space where you can voice these concerns anonymously.
Yeah, I totally buy that. I think it can be a good thing. But the problem is, wherever these anonymous communities are existing, the more anonymous it is, there's kind of a proportional toxicity that goes along with it. And that's just something that we have to account for. Like, not all of our communities should be that toxic. And I think we're strong enough as people that we can handle some of them being that toxic, and we should allow spaces for that. Like,
can you describe what you mean by toxic, or which communities?
Well, I mean, look at 4chan, right? Like, it's the most toxic place on the internet because it's basically the most anonymous place on the internet. But 4chan has also produced like half of this culture's memes on the internet level and on social media. It's like a funnel from like it goes from 4chan to Reddit, and then Twitter or Tumblr, and it kind of gets diluted down from there, but like with no filter at all. That it's kind of like a breeding ground for culture, and sometimes that culture is toxic.
So what do you mean by toxic? Like, what would be an example of something you'd consider toxic behavior or culture?
Stuff that is exclusionary, stuff that ratchets up divisiveness, obviously racism. 4chan is rank with racism, misogyny, all the usual stuff. There's a huge community of alt-right people on that website, and the people who are political on that website are alt-right, and the people who aren't alt-right just aren't political and they ignore them. And because it's so anonymous, that's just where they can gather. So yeah, so those things.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess one way that you might define that in a way that's not necessarily political is just to say that if you're in an anonymous space, you're allowed to express countercultural ideas. So, for instance, if the predominant culture was racist, misogynist, something like that, or alt-right, or or Nazis or something, like presumably, if there was something like 4chan in 1940, then Jews could go on there, I meant in 1940s Germany, Jews could go on there and they could like chat with each other about how they're going to escape or something, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's like a ridiculous example. And then maybe the Germans would view that as like toxic because it's allowing the dirty Jews to like communicate with each other, share their Jew memes with each other.
Sure.
So I mean, I guess, I mean, I'm not defending the alt-right here. I'm just saying that like, it seems as though that has to be defined in some way, or the way that you're defining toxicity is relative to whatever the culture is currently, and it's something that's like countercultural might be considered toxic in that way. Because I could argue that the stuff that you see happening on Facebook right now with people that are verified and they're like people that like your friends and family, that some of that culture is toxic. So like sort of a like virtue signaling call out type culture is something that could be considered toxic, where you can point at a person like James Gunn, so a real person in real life, and say, basically throw a lynch mob at them and try to get them fired or get them shamed or sort of ruin their career, which if they weren't connected to the platform by their identity, that wouldn't happen, right?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I don't think that only anonymous communities are toxic. I think that there's I talked about this proportion, like the toxicity is almost proportional with the anonymity. So even though on Twitter and Facebook you can put your real name on there, you're still disconnected in some way to the other person. There's areas of the internet where you have a username, but it's not your real name, and you're slightly more disconnected. And then there's the 4chans of the world, which are completely anonymous, and you can post anything that's legal to post, and
stuff that's illegal.
Yeah.
People do that all the time.
Yeah.
Probably half the content on 4chan is illegal.
I mean, I think that's a little bit of a myth, but
it's not half, but I'm sure there's a lot.
It does happen regularly.
Yeah, like I'm sure if we go to 4chan right now, like a top thread is going to be like post photos of your ex-girlfriend or something, which is that's borderline. Yeah, I think that this seems to me to actually be kind of parallel to the video games causing violence conversation that happens sometimes, because I think something that's happening is you see that people that are, let's call them unsavory, it's not clear whether the anonymous communities or like technology that's enabled by social media, I don't know if you call 4chan social media, but let's just throw that in there. So that's enabling unsavory characters to communicate with each other. Then there's a question of, is that actually causing those communities to form, or are those communities just there anyway and they're just naturally attracted to stuff like 4chan? Because I guess I'm thinking about, if I was going to list the bad things that are happening in the world right now and like who's doing them, 4chan and people on 4chan wouldn't be at the top of the list. Like for the most of the time, they're like sort of basement dwelling incels or trolls or whatever. And it's easy
but you can't say that 4chan isn't culturally relevant.
Oh yeah, of course it is. Of course it is. But I guess
there's an argument that like 4chan played a role in electing our last president, or our current president.
Sure. I mean, I think, so one thing that Russ Roberts talked about from Econ Talk when he was talking about this whole issue, I think he's like 50 or 60, and he was talking about how when he was growing up and he saw the world sort of transition from radio and TV as like the primary forms, and then sort of seeing the evolution of TV into, let's say, modern broadcast television, which isn't exactly the same as it was in like the 70s. And before social media became really big, you can see a similar phenomenon in terms of polarization and like toxic behavior and like narrative spin and stuff. This was happening on Fox News, for instance, or maybe it's a more recent phenomenon in CNN, but it was happening before then as well. And so he was saying that it's not just the internet or social media technology that is driving this. It's all media technology, including broadcast television, and carrying forward through the present. And of course, if you're going to look at, say, views of the dystopian future from before the internet existed, it's often people like glued to their TV screens or being fed propaganda. And so I think now I'm losing my original thread. I think there's something to be said for, it's not just about the way people can communicate with each other, but also the way that people think, maybe, or the way that the means by which people are connected to the culture, and like how, whether it's driven by, I think you mentioned this, like personal face-to-face connections with people rather than indirect information that you're getting from people like very far away. I guess what I'm saying is it's not totally clear to me how much anonymity plays into the arc of history here in terms of the impact that social media is having, but it could be pretty significant. Maybe I have to think about that more.
Well, I don't know if I'm making the claim that anonymity is making people more toxic. I think most of these toxic people always existed, and this is kind of the means by which they're conglomerating.
Mm-hmm.
And I just can't imagine the solution is, okay, well, they don't belong in the conversation, like, because they're going to be part of the conversation. We have to figure out how to talk to these people, in a way that isn't toxic.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess then the question is, do you want to be bullish or bearish on social media? Like, do you think it's, as a matter of prescription? I know Ezra Klein talked about this on the Vox show, where he interviewed someone who basically said you should just get off of social media immediately, or like stop paying attention to news and politics, and like start doing things in real life with real people. I mean, obviously, if you're an average person, you're already doing things in real life with real people, but maybe, we all know the data about how much time people spend checking their phones and refreshing Facebook.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've
this.
already talked about, like, not everybody should be participating in politics. Like, if this is something that's causing you serious anxiety, then yeah, get off social media. Like, you don't need to, you don't have to be a part of this conversation. But this is where the conversation is happening. Like, social media is obviously affecting huge parts of the culture and society. And if you want to participate in the conversation, you have to participate in social media. So I mean, as far as that goes, I'm pro social media, and I'm pro making social media better. I'm kind of agnostic about the way to do that.
Yeah. Well, it's not just a political thing, right? Because there's also problems that have been documented in terms of it can hurt your relationships with your friends and family, even in a non-political way, because you're so attached to it's like an addiction, right? Sort of like alcohol or drug addiction can be.
Yeah, it's a dopamine hit, and you can get addicted to any dopamine hit.
Yeah, and then there's problems with people getting quasi addicted to stuff like likes on Instagram or something, where their entire self-image is wrapped up in this idea of social approval, which before, I mean, it's not like social approval didn't exist before. Of course, you go to school and you go and see all the other, all the pretty girls or the hot guys or something, and you have a sense that you're being judged socially as well then. But I guess the difference with media now is that because it's both a new technology and it's being massively commodified, like before, if you go to school and how hot or not you are relative to the other girls there, for the most part, this just affects your self-esteem or how popular the other girls are or something. Whereas now, if you're on Instagram and there's sort of metrics of engagement that are being measured of you and sort of like exploited constantly.
You have objective observable metrics on like your hotness and likability now.
Well, that and that somebody is, or some emergent process is optimizing for that.
Yeah.
So you can be sort of manipulated without either you realizing that's happening or without the manipulator realizing that they're manipulating you at all, where you can start engaging in certain behaviors that might be ultimately self-destructive, but are, increasing ad revenue for the platform or something like that, or increasing engagement with the platform.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely see those as problems, and I think pointing them out as problems is a good idea because it's the only way that these platforms are going to improve. But I don't think that those problems are inherent to the platform necessarily.
Yeah, or another solution is promote or seek out platforms that mitigate this problem. So like for instance, I think that one of the bigger problems of social media is the current ad revenue model.
Yeah.
And so I really like subscription models, for instance, and I would be so much happier with Facebook if it just had like a $1 a month subscription model or something
Yeah.
like that to get rid of ads. I mean, I don't know how much money they make, so I don't know how much subscription you'd have to pay in order to remove ads on Facebook. But I think that model, it's not actually the ads that are the problem, in my opinion. It's that certain content gets promoted in a way that is completely opaque to you as a user. I know that Facebook has recently announced that they're trying to change this. They're trying to redesign their algorithm so that it shows you more stuff from your friends and family and less like news and less links and stuff like that. I've actually noticed that there's some subjective decline in that since the Zuckerberg testimony. I feel like I do see less political stuff on Facebook now, and I see more like pictures of friends on vacation. Is this something that you've noticed as well?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I've noticed a lot. I've browsed Facebook a lot less in the last year or so. I don't know why. I got kind of tired of all that stuff.
The Bay Area political rants and raves Facebook page.
God. Yeah. Yeah, if you want a good idea of like what the real political dialogue is like in this country, go to your Facebook and search for like a local political discussion group. Like if you live near a metro area, you probably have one. It's insane. It's ridiculous.
Yeah, that's one way to lose some faith in humanity. I mean, well, actually, this was one of these big questions. So the original topic, the intelligence squared debate I brought up, the prompt was, is social media good for democracy? And I think that's a super interesting question, because there's an implication in there that democracy is a good thing. Because I mean, I'm not taking an anti-democratic stance necessarily, but I think part of what we're realizing is that, who was it? There's some philosopher or something that said the best argument against democracy is like a 5-minute conversation with the average voter.
I feel like that was like Churchill.
I was gonna say it's Churchill.
Churchill. Every quote is from Churchill.
Every quote is just Winston Churchill. I'm pretty sure that was Abraham Lincoln that said this. So that's an interesting question, because maybe we're starting to walk that back. Like we're starting to think about, okay, maybe this is an inherent flaw in democracy that's only been demonstrated by the technology of social media, which is that you've got a bunch of people that think that they are doing something positive. They're like contributing to the conversation and the progress of the culture, but they actually just have no idea what they're talking about, because they're sort of inside of their own cultural echo chamber, and they're not like, I mean, it's not that you can expect the common man to be a political philosopher or to have like a master's degree in economics or anything. Yeah,
well, I mean, luckily social media doesn't dictate actual policy. We're not drafting bills on Twitter, and this kind of leads into, or maybe we should be. This kind of leads me to the 538 show I listened to.
Sure.
So one of the things that they mentioned is how.
Well, sorry, what was the title of this show?
Okay, hold on. So July 23rd. The title is Democratic Socialists Are Here to Stay. And this is the 538 Elections podcast. And
Great.
so one of the things that they mentioned was how a lot of the rhetoric that's coming from AOC and from Bernie and Warren and like this kind of progressive wing of the party, the rhetoric itself sounds pretty socialist, and it is a lot of like what's scaring the right and then the libertarians right now. But the actual policies that they're introducing are pretty moderate progressive policies. Like they're pretty like small step. Like they're not, abolishing institutions. And I mean, some of them are demanding large federal programs, but we don't know that that's what's going to happen. Like what does Ocasio-Cortez want? She wants like a federal jobs guarantee.
Yeah, she said jobs guarantee, free universal healthcare, universal basic income, and housing and education.
Yeah, so I mean, I think she says those things like she says those things, and this is a really charitable way to describe this, I know, but so she says those things because you can't explain like these baby step policies, like baby step progressive policies, to the average person who isn't a political wonk. I don't understand that shit either. the reason we have a democratic republic is because the purpose of the democracy is to kind of get the general feeling of where we want the country to go, and the representatives translate those feelings into actual workable policy and law.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you would say that the degree to which a political system is democratic is the degree to which that sort of distance between the citizenry and the representatives is flattened. So if it was totally flat, which is that the citizens were just, I don't know, doing like a referendum on all policy, then that would be like somehow pure, unfiltered democracy, which obviously is not really a thing. But although some people do call for that, strangely enough, but just say that that's not really a thing. But what you're pointing out is that the Democratic Party is finding way, or not just the Democratic Party, but Democratic Socialists as well. They're finding ways to communicate to the lay person in a way that sort of flattens that distance. They're not setting up these like institutional barriers of, if we're going to talk about policy, you've got to be like a policy analyst. You've got to have like a degree in econ, or you've got to have worked your way up through these institutions. And then once you've gone through those, then the public should sort of just trust that you are educated in that domain. That if you're going to make some claim about like minimum wage policy, that you have some reasonable expectation of understanding what's going to be the outcome of that. And so the danger that I see in that flattening is exactly the effect that you're describing now, which is that you've got people that are, they're publicly advocating for policies in a way that like a common person can understand. They're sort of framing it in a way that doesn't necessarily exactly mirror the actual policy itself. It's kind of like a way to sell it to people. And as far as I'm concerned, this is exactly the same thing that Trump is doing with phrases like build the wall, like drain the swamp and stuff like that. I mean, for all we know, he never actually intended to build a wall, and he never is going to. And he's just using this as a rhetorical device as a proxy to stand in for the idea of being bearish on immigration. Mm-hmm. And that if we just reduce immigration a little bit, to him, that's like, he had the big ask of building a wall, and then now we got like a little bit of the way there, and then
made
that's
a deal.
Yeah, exactly. He's just a master negotiator. And I think that this is, at best, I would say, not a good thing. Like, this isn't something that maybe it's inevitable with the changing, technological or cultural landscape, but I would say that that's something to at least be concerned about.
Well, what are you concerned about? What are you concerned about specifically? Like explain. Well, explain what you think isn't a good thing.
I'm concerned that you're going to get a large voting public, like a substantial amount of political power, especially democratic political power. I don't mean democratic as in on the political left, but I mean democratic as in rule of the majority, where if the majority decides to implement some policy in a sort of representationally flattened way, that is, there's like a large number of people that are deciding, and they're not delegating this to representatives or to like policy analysts or anything. And they're like, you know what? It seems like a really good idea for everyone to have universal basic income. So let's just make that a federal policy. Why not? And we're all organized enough, like we can create a Facebook group to go out and vote for universal basic income and get 10 million people to sign up to it. And we can make the biggest Facebook group so we get our way. And that's how democracy should be. It should be whoever has the biggest voice, the biggest amount of political power should be able to get together and decide the laws. And I think that is in some ways the opposite of like a king deciding the laws. And there's like some king just sitting in a castle, signing all the papers, like taxing all of the peasants. But then the opposite of that is you just have mob rule. You just have a ton of people that, we've got 51% of the power, so we can just implement whatever laws we want.
Yeah, so we don't want mob rule, but there aren't actually that many examples of that happening, at least not yet. Like, I think probably Brexit is the biggest example, and even that, like, that was an upset vote. I think probably more than 51% of people in the United Kingdom are against it now. Like, the solution to that is just not have these giant referendums that affect huge sweeping changes in policy. Like, my argument is that if 50 whatever percent of the population wants say universal basic income, what's not going to happen is a bill gets introduced for a federal program for that. What's going to happen is the Fed will try bigger and bigger trials and see if it works. And like, okay, I'm being very trusting and uncynical of our representatives, but I think most of them know how policy works, and I don't think we're in danger of 51% of the Senate turning into Ocasio-Cortez's.
Well, it's contingent. What your claim there about the trust in the well, first of all, everybody disagrees with you because nobody trusts the Congress. Nobody.
I don't trust them to get anything done, but like that's like serves my argument actually.
I mean, I'm on your side in that I do trust the Congress for the most part in crafting policy. But first of all, I don't trust them all the way. I just trust them for the most part.
Yeah.
And second of all, like most people don't. Like most people right now, the congressional approval rating is basically at an all-time low. People really don't, even when they've elected, they've democratically elected their representatives, they still have this notion of like everyone in Washington is corrupt. They're just like serving their own interests. They're subject to like lobbying and they just kind of like want to grab political power, unless there are guys. If there are guys, then they're sort of like the valiant champions of justice who are going to drain the swamp, and they each are looking at across the aisle there's like a swamp on the other side of the aisle that they're looking to drain. I mean, to your point, you're saying, in what way has this uprising of the demos actually changed policy? Well, now Trump is president, right? I mean, you could say that Trump is the embodiment of the demos. It's just the Republican demos, not the Democratic one. And I think, or I should say, the right-wing demos instead of the left-wing, because the whole idea is that we might want something that's more of a republic and less of a democracy, if what we're looking for is properly stacked layers of representation across the political hierarchy. So I guess I mean, we don't have to go on this too far, but to answer your previous question of what is my concrete level concern, it's that we're going to get more people that are like Trump, and we're just going to get them on the left side as well. We'll get them on the left and the right side.
Yeah.
Like my problem isn't necessarily with just one or the other, but that the political ecosystem, possibly driven forward by stuff like social media technology, is going to push us in a direction where you've got like a complete rando citizen thinks that they know something that's going to be good for policy, like free healthcare and free education for everyone. Like, of course, that sounds great. Why wouldn't you just get free healthcare and free education? And they don't understand the specifics of the policy that they are going to be supporting. They don't understand the character or the history or the skills of the representatives that they're supporting, because they're only picking the representatives based on these absurd campaign promises that they're making that they can't possibly deliver on. And then they're going to be supporting people that just they're voting for their team, and they're not voting for America in a certain way. Like, they're voting for somebody that is going to like obstruct the other side and sort of undo all of the stuff that the other side did when they had the majority in Congress, or when they had the presidency, or when they had the seats on the Supreme Court, or whatever it is. And on the one hand, I think that's okay. Like, I think it's okay to have two parties that are swapping, that are going back and forth, and there's some like competition there. That's fine. I mean, that's better than having one party completely dominate to the exclusion of everyone else. But of course, the downside is that if there is no compromise being made, polarization is increasing and increasing, and people are not looking at their fellow citizens as people that they just disagree with, but have like some shared values, that your fellow citizen, this goes back to our previous episode on civility, but that your fellow citizen is somehow like evil, and that they just want what's best for them, and they don't care about like minorities, or they don't care about unborn babies or anything. And I think that that's something that, if you had been seeing somebody in person and were talking to them at like a cafe or in like a student union or something, then you could disagree with them and still like acknowledge their humanity. And now you can just like throw them in the dustbin of deplorables, or SJW cucks. Or
I think we totally converge there. I mean, both of us are worried about divisiveness, and that's part of the reason why we're talking right now.
Yeah.
I think the only place we have differing intuitions here is to what degree Ocasio-Cortez is the leftist Trump, and like what the leftist Trump looks like. I don't think we're anywhere close to anyone in power being the leftist Trump yet, but I'm about as worried about that as you are.
Well, it's only 2 years until the election.
Yeah.
So
okay. Yeah, we'll see.
I certainly don't think that Bernie Sanders is going to storm the White House and snatch the throne away from Trump. But he might do that in like 2 years and then drop dead like 2 years later because he's 85. But anyway, all that aside, so maybe now that we're talking about this in some more substance, did you see the Ocasio-Cortez's appearance on Firing Line?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so basically there's this meme going around on Twitter because she had this interview on Firing Line, which, as we mentioned like 30 minutes ago before it got derailed, this was a talk show that was fairly contentious back in the day when William Buckley was the host. And first of all, the episode was a bit strange because the host now her name is...
There's like one episode, right? Like this is the only episode. They just brought it back.
Oh no, 28 relaunch. Oh yeah, you're right. They did just bring it back. April 2018. Interesting. Okay, so PBS just brought back Firing Line, and now it's hosted by Margaret Hoover. So I have nothing against Margaret Hoover. I think that she was a fine host, but it's a very different style than William Buckley, who's, like I said, a very like aggressive, sort of cynical conservative who you can think about him like Christopher Hitchens. He asks very like pointed questions and speaks very like a high-minded sort of philosophical way. Mm-hmm. Whereas Margaret Hoover, she's very smiley. She's like kind of talking like this all the time. And like, even when she was asking pointed questions, she was smiling and trying to be emphatic. And it was clear that she had some sympathies with Ocasio-Cortez because she's also a young, successful woman in politics. And I think they were sort of bonding over that. But anyway, the point is, at some point in the interview, Hoover was asking Ocasio-Cortez about a comment that she made on Twitter about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And for background here, Ocasio-Cortez has a degree in econ and international relations. And so I guess Ocasio-Cortez had mentioned that there is a occupation in Palestine, that Israel was like occupying Palestine and was basically trying to colonize it or something. And that Palestine, actually, I can just play the clip. So here's the clip that was making the rounds on social media and that folks like Ben Shapiro just roundly criticized.
Yes, but I also think that what people are starting to see, at least in the occupation of Palestine, is just an increasing crisis of humanitarian condition. And that to me is just where I tend to come from on this issue.
You use the term the occupation of Palestine. What did you mean by that?
I think what I meant is like the settlements that are increasing in some of these areas and places where Palestinians are experiencing difficulty in access to their housing and homes.
Do you think you can expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd also I am not the expert on geopolitics on this issue. You know, for me, I'm a firm believer in finding a two-state solution in this issue, and I'm happy to sit down with leaders on both of these. For me, I just look at things through a human rights lens.
Okay, so that was the clip, and
yeah, that was really good interviewing too. Like that,
it was. This was by far the hardest that Hoover went during this interview. For the most part, it was pretty cordial, and then when she pointed out this inconsistency, she like really dug into it. Which I
love those follow-ups. That was fantastic. Yeah, I mean, I think it's fine to not be an expert on Israel and Palestine. I don't think if you're I don't think if you're a public official, like you have to have an opinion on it and be going after a specific policy. But yeah, if you're gonna mention it, then you should have like some kind of canned phrase at least that makes some kind of sense and isn't just like obviously dumb.
Yeah, I mean, I think the context that this was brought up in was Ocasio-Cortez was comparing this, like recently some Palestinians died in some sort of military conflict with Israel. Usually the way these things go is the Israelis don't die and the Palestinians do, because the Israeli army has way more resources. So she was comparing what happened in this particular conflict with like when people had died rioting in the US, or like, I don't remember exactly what she mentioned, but something like black people rioting, like there's Black Lives Matter or something in Ferguson. And so she was comparing the deaths there and saying, oh, this is like the same thing. And then Hoover brought up, this is a complex geopolitical issue, as opposed to, I'd be more amenable to this idea of people dying trying to protect their freedom of speech rights in the United States. Like, are those really comparable situations? And so the problem that people saw with Ocasio-Cortez, and this is the interview had a bunch of other moments like this, where she was basically commenting on stuff that she clearly didn't really know anything about, and she was taking like this moral stance, like obviously this is like a moral wrong that's happening, and she was using it to sort of bolster her own political capital, when she actually didn't have any idea of what she was talking about. And there's other, it's like a half an hour interview. You can go and watch it. And I recommend that.
When people use the phrase virtue signaling, like this is the most.
It's a prototypical example. Yeah, and there's a few other times because Hoover was asking her like what her definitions of socialism are and like the types of things that she would like to see. And Ocasio-Cortez just made a bunch of obviously wrong claims about the economy and about like the current state of the economy and just how economics works. And the fact that she's both an economics major and an international relations major, and then claims through invocation of that to have some sort of like expertise in this area and is bootstrapping that into her political campaign. I mean, it's not anything to say bad about her individually, because she is in some way just the embodiment of this cultural zeitgeist that just wants to look at the selling points like, oh yeah, I want universal healthcare, or I want to abolish ICE. And that seems like that makes sense to my moral intuitions. So I'm going to support a candidate that is supporting those things, even if it's clear that she has no like proven expertise on any of these topics. Like she cannot withstand any sort of examination deeper than like surface level.
Like single follow-up question.
Right. Yeah, exactly. It wasn't even like a super tough follow-up question. It was just like, oh, you said that.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that? Oh,
I'm
just saying things.
Didn't mean anything.
Yeah.
What was I saying?
I'm just saying shit. Like, I'm not the expert on these issues. I'm just talking about them as though I am. Like, I don't know why anyone would consider me such. It's not like I'm going to be, in the governing body of the most powerful government in the history of the human civilization, but it's fine.
Go ahead and direct that follow-up question to my local NPR station.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I recommend watching that interview, and a bunch of people were discussing their takes on it. I think that there's now a, just as there's a democratic socialist uprising on the left, there's a surge of like libertarian classical liberalism on the right, and they're maybe a little bit more center right, and they're seeking to take away power from the federal government. And those are the people in large part that are taking stances against Ocasio-Cortez, although there are actually a strange amount of Republicans that are sympathetic to some of the policies, because Ocasio-Cortez and Sanders they're trying to orient themselves as being like pro-working class, and they're selling some similar narratives as Trump in terms of like being against the TPP way back when, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, being pro-isolationist foreign policy, like reduction in trade and like sort of keeping jobs in America instead of outsourcing them. So there's some tension there. I could see people on the right breaking, especially working class people, breaking towards these narratives, because like really the only thing stopping them is caring about the Second Amendment or trying to preserve rights under the Constitution. But in terms of the economic message, I think that's there, which is that what we really want to do is preserve the working class and, I don't know, topple the banks or big business or corporations or whatever sort of capitalist boogeyman can be pointed to as the cause of social ills.
Yeah, well,
it remains to be seen whether they will get that support.
Yeah,
though.
I mean, they're clearly trying to capture the white working class Trump voter that maybe was turned off by some of Trump's social comments, but like he was also the only one talking about draining the swamp and being anti-establishment, and I'm sure that resonates with some portion of the Midwest white working class.
Yeah. Okay, well, if you're getting tired of this sort of dry political nonsense, let's talk about something fun. Let's talk Guardians of the Galaxy.
Yeah.
So if you haven't heard, there's a recent controversy over James Gunn, who is the director of Guardians of the Galaxy. He was fired like last week or something by Disney over a series of tweets that he made back in like 2009, 2010. Mm-hmm. So this was, he's kind of a young guy, so this is pretty early in his career.
Yeah, that notably way before he got hired by Disney.
Yeah, way before he got hired by Disney, way before he made Guardians of the Galaxy. I think he was like 20 something. And also keep in mind, 2009, 2010, I mean, I was like a senior in high school or just started college, and I didn't even know Twitter was a thing at the time. So this was very early days in Twitter history. I don't know what the culture was like back then because I've only got on it like this year, but I'm assuming that there's a bunch of people just making like one-off little comments and sort of playing around with the character limit and seeing what that.
Yeah, I wasn't on Twitter back then either, but from what I can tell, it was kind of like nobody really knew what the platform was for or like how to use it. So yeah, we kind of had like a period of development there, like a kind of a sophomoric, and we're probably still in that. Like the Twitter culture wasn't so much a thing.
You wouldn't say that Twitter is an incredibly mature and developed place right now? I mean, the ecosystem's interesting. Let me pull up a couple of the James Gunn tweets in question.
All right, I'll try to sit here and listen without cringing.
Yeah, sure.
Audibly.
Well, it's pretty much impossible. If you've been following this at all, you've probably heard tweets like this. But in 2010 or so, he says something like, "The Expendables was so manly, I fucked the shit out of the little pussy boy next to me. The boys are back in town." In 2009, he retweeted somebody, and presuming there's some context there, he says, "I like it when little boys touch me in my silly place. Shush. Hashtag unromantic movies. 3 men and a baby they had sex with." That's funny. I mean, there's a bunch of stuff like this where he's just tweeting edgy sex or pedophile related jokes, and from my perspective, having been a teenager on the internet, I'm sure I could go back onto my Facebook and see like similar stupid shit.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of stuff that's dumb and edgy, and when you're a teenager, it's fun to be dumb and edgy. And we even like, I think we went through a period in our culture where our media was getting a dumb and edgy feel to it. Stuff like Aqua Teen Hunger Force and Adult Swim back then got really popular and did that kind of stuff.
Yeah, there's a shock humor culture.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, shows like South Park and Family Guy were really popular, and a lot of what they did was just make, I mean, they weren't exactly as cringy as these, because this guy's not a professional comedian, but it's in a similar vein, right?
And I think what we've learned is that like Twitter is a specific kind of public space that does not provide a lot of context for whatever you're going to tweet out. So it doesn't matter really that your offensive tweet isn't as offensive in context at this point, because like you should just know about Twitter when you're posting on it.
Right.
You should just know that like there's a time and a place for this kind of edgy dumb shit, and it's not like in the public sphere of Twitter.
Yeah, I mean, to me, the difference here is like, say that you're going to go into a job interview and your prospective employer searches you on Facebook and then sees your profile picture and you're like doing a keg stand with your shirt off or something.
Yeah.
And they're like, okay, I don't really want to hire that guy. But say instead they go to your Facebook and they see, oh, he's got like a really nice professional photograph. You know, he just recently got married to his wife and he has a cute dog. And 10 years ago when he was in high school, he's got a photo of him doing a keg stand. Or whatever, freshman in college, right?
And stay legal here.
Yes. I mean, it's still 18, but anyway, but that's the difference to me, right? Like it makes sense to evaluate someone based on their public image, but I don't think it makes sense to ensconce that to evaluate statements made in the public 10 years ago when you're like a young 20-something or like teenager and have that reflect your career. I mean, the interesting thing about this James Gunn situation is that after all this controversy came out and he got fired, the cast of the Guardians of the Galaxy came out in support of him. So like Dave Bautista, who plays Drax, sent out a bunch of tweets basically standing by him and saying he's like really, really nice, loving, caring guy, great at his job, treats everyone with respect. Obviously not a pedophile. Like the fact that anybody looked at these tweets and thought, oh, this guy's actually a pedophile is just completely absurd. That was Ted Cruz jumped into the fray and was like, oh, maybe he should actually be investigated and prosecuted.
Yeah.
Like that's just stupid.
We just have to be able to believe that people can change. Otherwise, like why, like if we don't believe that people can change and have a mechanism that allows them to genuinely change, they're never going to, because they're never going to say the things that need to be changed.
Well, also, why not just judge everybody by who they were when they were 13?
Yeah.
Like, what's the proper time at which to consider a person's behavior as emblematic of who they are today? Like, I wouldn't want to be judged by anything I did when I was 13.
Yeah.
It just happens that when I was 13, I wasn't on social media, so thank goodness. But like if you've got an entire culture where everyone is growing up on social media and they're like navigating through the world and making like cringy comments and saying stupid stuff as part of their like normal social development, and that's like used against them in the future to get them fired from like
and
to
especially
ruin their careers.
and especially now that I'm too old for my dumb cringy phase to have been concretized on the internet forever. Like I don't have dumb YouTube videos of myself, but I'm sure if I was growing up now I would.
Right.
And we have to figure out how to not judge people for the dumb stuff that they said when they were young.
Yeah, I mean the fact is if you don't have social media, people still say dumb stuff when they're young. It's just not documented.
Yeah.
So then the question is, okay, maybe one solution to this is have everything stay the same, just don't say anything on social media anymore. Just completely censor yourself and make sure that you never say anything that's offensive, even if you're 12, or never say anything that goes against like a social norm or taboo at the time. And that's obviously not going to necessarily lead to better outcomes, because that could just lead to a bunch of people self-censoring, but they still like secretly harbor these ideas anyway. And they're not going to, well, I don't even know what I mean by these ideas. I mean, in this case, it's just stupid jokes, but they're not even going to get that feedback that it's something that is bad or that it's good. If they have a good idea and it goes against the social norm, then they're not going to share it, right?
Yeah.
You certainly wouldn't want to say that you were a progressive socialist or like a feminist, and you live in a culture where if you said anything that was pro-gay rights or pro-trans people or pro-socialism, and then you just get like McCarthy'd on and like thrown out of the room or blacklisted from working at companies because you said something that was pro-communist at some point in your Facebook history. Obviously that wouldn't be a good thing. And I think it's something that was brought up like years ago as a possible concern when we saw some of these witch hunts happening. And I think the line at the time was, yeah, but that's just the boogeyman. Like, this wouldn't really happen. That's just a slippery slope fallacy or something. And now we've seen the Netflix COO fired, or was it the director of marketing? An executive at Netflix was fired. James Gunn, who's working on Guardians of the Galaxy, was fired. These aren't like low profile cases. These are people that are driving the culture. And this is just some like obvious examples of stuff getting dredged up from Twitter that everyone has heard about. But there can certainly be other cases where similar things have happened that just happened like a backroom HR decision that nobody even knew happened.
Yeah, and there's a pragmatic argument here too, because like James Gunn it's come out since and been publicized that he's spoken out against this kind of toxicity since having been a changed person and being hired by Disney and having his worldview changed. And there's an argument that the best people to have speak out against those things are the people who once advocated them. Like,
well, when you say toxic behavior, you mean making the edgy jokes on Twitter?
Yeah.
Okay. Because I would say that's not really particularly toxic. It's just cringy. Because toxic sort of implies that this is going to have some sort of like negative outsized effect on the culture that's going to spread. I mean, I don't see somebody writing these cringy tweets then turning into like, there's a cultural phenomenon of people of pedophilia like sweeping the nation, right?
Yeah, but it normalizes this kind of toxic, edgy humor that we don't want in the media. Like it,
but like, why is that toxic? I don't see.
Well, do you think
I see the witch hunting as being toxic?
Well, of course it is. But do you think it would be like, would we be having a different conversation if he tweeted all these things yesterday?
Yeah, I mean, we probably would. But if you tweeted these things yesterday, I wouldn't call it toxic behavior. I would call it, maybe a PR disaster at best. I don't even necessarily disagree with Disney over firing him in this case, because it was a PR disaster, and generally speaking, you don't want to have that in your employees. But I think the logical extension of this is that every single person you could ever hire is going to end up being a PR disaster, as long as the rule is if anybody has ever said something stupid, dredge it up and get them fired. And I think saying something stupid should certainly not be equivocated with toxic behavior, because in my mind, part of toxic behavior is something that is going to get socially perpetuated. It's not something that you say it's cringy and then people make fun of you, or you get fired, or you're looked down upon, or you get like negative social feedback. Something that receives negative social feedback, I don't see as being toxic.
Yeah, but why does it receive negative social feedback then?
Because it's just cringy and awkward and people don't like it.
I don't know. I think this kind of stuff, like, he's a public figure. You're
Well, first of all, he's not a public figure. He's like hired by. He's forced.
He's got a
into
check
public,
mark on Twitter.
Well,
He's a
sure.
public figure.
Oh, I get it. I mean, he's been forced into public figury, but I mean, he's just a private citizen who has been hired by a private company to
Yeah,
do
but he
job,
has a
like, to make money.
responsibility as a dude with a blue check mark on Twitter. Like, he's going to be influencing future filmmakers, future people in media. And if we don't want this kind of dumb, edgy humor in our media, then it can't be on the people who make our media's Twitter.
Well, yeah, I mean, we're not disagreeing on that. I'm not saying that these are things that somebody should be tweeting. I'm just saying things that you shouldn't do and toxic behavior are not completely overlapping.
All right,
circles.
well, I don't know. Maybe I have a slightly larger Venn diagram of what I consider to be toxic. Like, this kind of stuff I wouldn't associate with a person who posts this kind of stuff all the time. I just think it's boring and dumb and edgy.
Right.
And I think it perpetuates and normalizes being boring and dumb and cringy and edgy. And that's like, I don't think that's the most toxic thing in the world, but it is like low level toxic.
Well, what would you call something that is bad that a person shouldn't do that you wouldn't also call toxic? Or are those equivalent concepts to you?
Yeah, I don't know if I can think of an example immediately, but yeah, maybe they are. Like I said, I see toxicity as a spectrum, and maybe this is on the low end of the spectrum of toxicity. Like, you know, he's not being like actively racist or aggressive against specific individuals. He's not going after other random people on Twitter. He's not necessarily punching down, you know, stuff like that. But he's still perpetuating bad memes.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess I just want to dig into this idea because I see, so the popular usage of the word toxic is in stuff like toxic masculinity.
Mm-hmm.
So it's referred to concepts or behaviors that are in some way endemic, right? Like the word toxic implies something like, you know, you eat a bagel and you didn't realize it had like arsenic in it, so it's toxic, right? I think for the most part, when people are talking about toxicity, they're talking about, I mean, are not like consciously deciding to do this, but I think what they're talking about is some sort of, as you say, meme or repeated pattern of thought or behavior that spreads a bunch amongst of people in a way that they don't see that as bad. So for instance, like the claim about toxic masculinity is that it's not like the masculine people are, you know, sadists or something, or maybe that's part of it, but it's more like they're perpetuating cultural stereotypes that they think is probably good, but they don't realize that's having like negative externalities. So I would say that behavior like this is like cringy edgelordiness. I mean, for the most part, that's not really supported or promoted by culture anywhere. Like for the most part, people that make comments like that, I think any like if you walked into a Guardians of the Galaxy screening and showed them a picture of one of these tweets without the person's name attached to it, and you just said, hey, what do you think about this tweet? They would say, that's really stupid. It was probably posted by a 12-year-old or something.
Yeah.
They wouldn't say like, oh yeah, you know, young boys are sexy. Like this, you know, like I'm going to go home and tweet about that. That's like a really funny tweet, right?
Yeah, but I've made the case about the way in which this is endemic and the way in which it does spread. Like, because it spreads the normalization of being edgy and cringy and dumb in this way.
Yeah, I suppose so, but
like,
I just don't really see that happening, I guess. Like I don't see edgy, cringy dumbness being part of the like the cultural zeitgeist.
Well, that's because this happened 10 years ago and it kind of died down since then.
Well, with Gunn, sure, but like oh, you mean just like the general phenomenon?
But I mean,
like
if you go, like if we just talked about anonymous communities, if you go to those communities that we talked about, this is exactly the kind of stuff you see there.
Right. Yeah, that's true. But I mean, like in those communities, I would say, as you pointed out, there's sort of a spectrum where there's some stuff on 4chan that's really, really dumb and like lowest common denominator. And there's some stuff that's actually really funny. And there's stuff that like drives the culture in a lot of ways. And I think that sort of, you could see it as, it's like a rapid mutation. It's like annihilation, right? There's this little bubble of space where things just mutate really, really rapidly, and some stuff dies and some stuff becomes super well adapted to the environment. And I think that if you sort of put a ban on this type of interaction, and I don't mean ban as in like literally ban him from Twitter, but ban as in, hey, by the way, if you say anything that might be looked down upon 10 years from now, then and you're going to get fired, you should just keep your mouth shut, sort of thing. If you have that sort of rule, which you say any behavior that is considered bad from any possible future perspective, that's toxic and therefore you shouldn't do it. And
Yeah.
people never figure out, like they never learn, like they never figure out whether their tweets are good or not. And I think like in a case like this, I mean, you can clearly look at them and see, you know, the likes and retweets of these things are like, you know, 5 likes, like 6 retweets.
Yeah, well, it was this was before you got the check mark, right?
Well, I don't even think check marks were a thing back
like
then.
this kind of like, okay, these jokes are bad, but in general, I'm not making the case that edginess is like edgy humor is always toxic. If you're like a comedian and you're like that's your stick, you're like an edgy comedian and you say edgy stuff and like a lot of people enjoy that kind of thing, that's fine. Go to a theater or a comedy club and you do it within that context. But posting it on Twitter isn't the place to do it.
Yeah, and I mean, also I think there is an argument there that sometimes edgy humor actually is toxic. So like sometimes they'll pretend to be sort of sarcastic about being like misogynist or sexist, or, you know, a lot of people have criticized Jeff Dunham for his, you know, his fairly racist depiction of like a Islamic extremist and hand puppet thing.
Yeah.
And then there's a whole debacle with Kramer from Seinfeld a few years ago, said the N-word in a crowd, like at a comedy club, in like a very aggressive way, and it was sort of like trying to pass it off as a joke, but obviously it wasn't really.
Yeah, well, I mean, no. Okay, well, what happened there was he. I'm not like defending Kramer here, but like we get the facts straight. Like he, I think he was arguing with a heckler, and when someone heckles you as a comedian, what you're taught as a comedian like is to immediately go after them unpunishingly, no mercy, say whatever you have to say to just shut them up and get the crowd on your side.
Right.
And that's what he was doing, but he obviously failed at it.
Well, right, but what I'm saying there is that it's fair to me to say if you're in that stance, to call someone an N-word is totally unacceptable, and that's toxic.
Yeah.
Because that's perpetuating the idea that if you're criticizing somebody strongly, their race is a reasonable way to criticize them.
Yeah. No, I'm just saying that he wasn't making his routine. That wasn't part of his routine.
Well, I gotcha. But I guess my ultimate point there is that I'm not just talking about edgy humor in itself. I'm talking about the idea that anything that you could do that's considered like bad or cringy is toxic, and therefore should be like things that are to be considered toxic should rightly be quelled more strongly than things that aren't. So I would say that if someone's reading these tweets about like fucking the pussy boy in your theater where you're watching the
way
Expendables,
to pick the one with the most the most curse words in it.
Well, yeah, sorry, I but we can bleep that out.
Yeah, no, I'm going to.
But I'm just saying that obviously no one's going to look at these tweets and be like, yeah, actually pedophilia is a little bit more okay than I thought it was before. Like obviously that's satire. And this is where, this is where comedy gets hard, because people do skirt the line between what's acceptable and what's unacceptable. And in some ways, although this is stupid, in some ways the best way of evaluating if something is acceptable or not is whether it's funny. Because you can't actually really tell whether there's not like a lawyer can't look at a tweet and decide whether it's an acceptable form of satire or if they really meant it, or if it was like actually misogynist or pedophilic or something.
Yeah, and like there's an argument that like if these were funny and if he was doing it in a context that made them more funny, like if he was a comedian doing these on stage, I don't know that we would have quite the same conversation about it. I think we basically agree there.
Well, sorry, just to go to what you were saying right now, almost the exact same thing did happen with Anthony Jeselnik. So let me pull that up. So like a few days after this James Gunn thing blew up, somebody dug into Anthony Jeselnik's Twitter history. And for those who don't know, Anthony Jeselnik is basically a shock comic who's appeared on many a Comedy Central roast. This is exactly the type of context that Travis was just talking about. So here, Joshua Brown, went through his Jeselnik's Twitter history, and then he says, I plan on talking to my kids about sex early, like 6 or 7 a.m. And child molesters must all think they've got huge dicks, huge in all caps. I will never understand how a mother can kill her own baby and not get away with it. Anyway, just a similar kind of edgy, offensive tweets. Some of these were a little bit more recent, but most of them were pretty old as well, like 2009, 2010. And this is back when Jeselnik was an active shock comedian. So he was making jokes like this in his stand-up routines. And the whole point was to just like start sounding like you're saying something that's reasonable and then end it by, subverting the theme so that you're actually talking about pedophilia or killing or infanticide, right? And the whole point is that that's how you create the shock or like surprise factor that makes it funny.
Mhm.
And so this is something where, for the most part, Twitter was on Jeselnik's side, saying like, obviously this guy's a comedian, he's a shock comedian. Why would you think that he would be a pedophile or that this is something that he should get fired over?
Yeah.
Because someone was calling for him to get his for Netflix to fire him because he just recently got a special on Netflix.
Yeah, so this is his shtick. I'm kind of ambivalent about whether he should be doing the exact same thing on Twitter, but I don't know. Like if you go to one of his tweets and you're offended because you didn't realize he's like a comedian and then this is his shtick, then I don't know. Okay, like maybe that's on you.
Yeah, and to bring the conversation back to a more general view, I think that we as a society need to decide what we're going to consider acceptable or not, because like obviously Disney had a right to fire James Gunn.
And by acceptable, we mean like fireable or like non-fireable.
Well, the thing is, obviously Disney had a right to fire James Gunn.
Yeah.
I mean, they're a private company. They can fire anyone they want for whatever reason. Obviously, they could hire somebody else to represent their brand that they think is going to be a better ambassador or not have PR problems. But really the question is do we want that?
Yeah.
Because I personally really like the Guardians of the Galaxy movies. I thought that James Gunn did a really good job with them. And I think that it's not like you can just put any random person in and have them do as good of a job. I'm sure that part of the reason that James Gunn or really anybody can do a good job on something, on a project of that scale and magnitude, where you have to represent so many different characters and storylines and convey so many messages in such a nuanced and interesting and like multi-layered way. I don't think that's possible if you're not allowed to express yourself when you're young. And I don't think it's possible if you are in an environment where what you say has to be strictly regulated by the social and cultural norms like around you. And I don't think it's possible if you're not going to be taking advantage of technology and of media to push back your ideas against against reality and your social reality and get that feedback. And I think that if we're going to say as a society that we want people like that to be fired, or we want people to be held accountable for stuff that they said when they were 10 years younger on like a brand new social networking platform, I think that that's in a lot of ways deeply damaging. And I think that the trends make it seem like that's going to get worse before it gets better.
Yeah.
I
think we agree on pretty much all of that. I think we need more forgiveness. We need less witch hunts. We need both of those things as much or more than we need less toxicity.
And I mean, honestly, the fact that this is a PR disaster at all is kind of bizarre to me, because as a fan of Disney,
before you go on,
sure.
So, I think the converging point of our takes on this is really encapsulated by this meme that I saw.
Okay, sure.
And I'm not gonna like, I know podcast formats aren't the best place to showcase a meme, but okay, I'm gonna show it to you while I describe it.
Okay.
So it's just an image macro. Disney says, "We can't continue our relationship with James Gunn due to the jokes he tweeted years ago." And then me, and it's a screenshot of Song of the South. The racist Oriental cat from
The Aristocrats.
The Aristocats.
The Aristocats, yes.
Yeah. Yeah. The Native American scene from what's that song?
I don't remember what it's called, but I know what you're talking about.
It's massively racist.
Yeah.
From Peter Pan, and then like something else I don't recognize.
This is from Fantasia. There's this blackface centaur who is clearly a racist depiction.
Yeah.
Who's shining the shoes or like polishing the hooves of this hot white female centaur.
Yeah.
That was later edited out of Fantasia.
Yeah, so you can say,
that's hilarious.
like, you can say that those things, like, oh, those happened like 50 and 60 years ago and not like 10 years ago. But I mean, like, that was Disney's teenage years, right?
Right, exactly. So why buy into Disney as a brand at all? You should just boycott all their movies and let all of the people who work for Disney quit and then join a new company with a different brand, and that'll be a totally different thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that like it's fine to criticize Disney for that, and they've changed. Like they did, they removed some of the racist stuff from Fantasia, and they
they obviously acknowledge it. Like they know that they did that. They don't distribute Song of the South anymore. They obviously don't create scenes like this anymore, and they're very conscious about it. But so is James Gunn.
Right. Yeah. And I would say that stuff is definitely toxic in the sense that at the time, Disney had like a huge platform.
Yeah.
And they were like distributing that. And people probably saw the Siamese cat and they're like, ha ha ha, ha.
Yeah.
Asians. So silly, those Asians, in a way that I'm sure this wasn't really happening with the cringy Twitter memes. But yeah, we can put a nail on this James Gunn issue.
Yeah.
Let's just not do this, you guys. Let's just
just
be
stop.
cool.
Yeah, stop firing people over the dumb Twitter crap that they said.
Like, why would you keep someone, like, would you hold your brother or like your neighbor accountable for that sort of stuff? I
You wouldn't block them. You wouldn't like put a restraining order in them and then try to get them fired. You'd go talk to them. You'd try to change their mind.
Yeah, and then they would probably just say like, "Oh yeah, I was a teenager. It was stupid."
Yeah,
and then you're like, "Oh okay, great."
And then everybody's
Glad we both agree
comfortable.
on that. Yeah, exactly. It would be really funny if James Gunn responded and was like, "Oh, I think those tweets were hilarious. I was a genius when I was a kid. Why are you firing me over that? I should get a promotion. I should get my own Netflix special with Anthony Jeselnik." Okay, were there any other topics that we want to talk about?
I'm fine moving on to Trump.
Trump and Putin.
Yeah.
Okay, so do you have the skinny on what happened with Trump and Putin? Do you feel comfortable? Do you want to summarize this?
I mean, not really.
Okay, I can summarize it. So basically, Trump was at a summit or a conference with Vladimir Putin, and this is in the wake, like a couple months after Putin, quote unquote, won his re-election. It's well known that Putin has extremely anti-democratic policies where it's essentially rigged in his favor. He's always going to win every election. There's no way that that's ever not going to happen. He assassinates critics. He assassinates political opposition. He strongmans people into, he can even change polls in his favor. He has control over the Russian media, and he can just influence everybody to think that he's amazing and silence dissidents. So nobody who is an expert on these topics would say that Putin had a free and fair election. Everyone thinks that Putin is a thug, or knows that Putin is a thug and that he's an authoritarian and he's a dictator, basically. And way back when, so those 2 months ago or so, when Putin won the election, Trump had made some public comment saying, congratulations to Putin for winning your election. Like, great job. You're such an impressive, democratic
strong and
figure.
powerful.
Yeah, exactly. And I really like your pecs. So then now Trump showed up at the summit with Putin, and he was asked publicly about the association between Russia and the attempts to meddle in the U.S. 2016 election. And it's also well known. It's a consensus of is it 11 or 17?
17.
Thank you. Of the 17 U.S. intelligence agencies, it's consensus that Russia, as led by Putin, actively meddled in the 2016 election. They favored Trump. They hacked into Hillary Clinton's private email server and
the DNC.
And there's the indictment had just come out like a week previous to Trump making these comments, or a week prior to this summit, that basically just put the nail in the coffin on there was certainly Russian involvement, and they even singled out individual Russian.
Yeah, they indicted like 12 people, right?
Right, exactly. And so it's well known that Putin favored Trump, and that or that at the very least he wanted to sow discord in the American election by meddling in it. And Trump, when asked about this, basically said, "Oh, I see no reason why."
Yeah, why don't we just play that clip?
Yeah,
real quick,
we can play
because
the clip.
it's incredible.
Yeah.
President Putin, did you want President Trump to win the election, and did you direct any of your officials to help him do that?
Да, я хотел, чтобы он выиграл.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did. Because he talked about bringing the U.S.-Russia relationship back to normal.
People came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be, but I really do want to see the server.
Yeah, and then what was it, like the next day, the White House released the statement, or Trump said himself, he corrected himself here.
So I'll begin by stating that I have full faith and support for America's great intelligence agencies, always had. and I have felt very strongly that while Russia's actions had no impact at all on the outcome of the election, let me be totally clear in saying that, and I've said this many times, I accept our intelligence community's conclusion that Russia's meddling in the 2016 election took place. Could be other people also. There's a lot of people out there. There was no collusion at all. And people have seen that, and they've seen that strongly. The House has already come out very strongly on that. A lot of people have come out strongly on that. I thought that I made myself very clear by having just reviewed the transcript. Now, I have to say, I came back and I said, what is going on? What's the big deal? So I got a transcript, I reviewed it. I actually went out and reviewed a clip of an answer that I gave. And I realized that there is a need for some clarification. It should have been obvious. I thought it would be obvious, but I would like to clarify just in case it wasn't. In a key sentence in my remarks, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't, or why it wouldn't be Russia. So just to repeat it, I said the word would instead of wouldn't. And the sentence should have been, and I thought it would be maybe a little bit unclear on the transcript or unclear on the actual video. The sentence should have been, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't be Russia. Sort of a double negative. So you can put that in, and I think that probably clarifies things pretty good by itself. I have on numerous occasions noted our intelligence findings that Russians attempted to interfere.
Okay, so
It is completely insane. Like, who is buying this? Who is buying this wouldn't thing?
right.
You
Obviously,
don't have to listen.
he meant that he wouldn't.
You have to listen more than like 10 seconds of the actual original clip to realize like he's so obviously saying the complete opposite. And I'd never seen this clip before in video when he reads I accept our intelligence agency's confirmation or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
I'd never seen the actual video, but you can look at his face and he's almost begrudgingly reading this off the sheet. Like and then
So I just said him like read the prompter. Read it.
Yeah. And then as soon as he finishes with the sentence, he looks up and he says, "Oh, could be other people too."
Yeah. As though he like doesn't believe what he just wrote, like or what he just read. Like I had to read that, but yeah, it could be other people. But I see no reason why it wouldn't be Russia. I don't know how that wasn't clear. Like
it was so obvious. Yeah, that clears everything up.
Yeah. So
do you have any Twitter takes on this?
So, well, first of all, the obvious implication here is that Trump has absolutely no idea what's going on, and that he basically just wanted to, I don't know, stroke Putin's ego or like be on his good side or something and just say like, oh yeah, totally, I trust all the intelligence agencies, and yet unanimously they think that Russia meddled the election, and then I'm just saying, oh no, he totally didn't. And then 5 minutes later he says, oh, I said wouldn't instead of would. And so he clearly is not taking an actual stance on anything.
Yeah.
He's not, at best you could say that he's got some like political machinations going on here where he doesn't want to just like outright say in front of Putin that he thinks that he meddled in the election. So maybe just doesn't want to give his hand away or something. Well, but he's been roundly gobsmacked by the Republicans and the Democrats for this conciliatory tone.
I've seen like three what I would call plausible interpretations of what's going on here. And so like from least charitable to most charitable, I think the least charitable plausible interpretation here is that there was collusion and Trump is literally like a Russian agent or whatever.
Right, he's in Putin's pocket.
Yeah, whatever. And then the kind of middle ground is, okay, well maybe there was no collusion, but Trump is obviously coddling up to Putin for some reason. Maybe Putin has some dirt on him or something like that he's holding over Trump's head so that Trump doesn't say something too negative about Russia.
I mean, I would say the medium take is more like, I mean, you don't need to necessarily have those explanations. It could be any reason. It could just be that he likes Putin. It could just be that he wants his,
Yeah, but why? Why would he like Putin?
Because, well,
Who's he trying to please? Like,
the theory,
nobody likes Putin.
The Twitter theory is that Trump sees, or like this is something that Ezra Klein has suggested, I think, is that Trump sees Putin as in some way a like a role model. Like he likes having power, he likes being like a strong man, and Putin is like the prototypical example of that. Like nobody tells Putin what to do.
Yeah. Okay.
He
so
just gets whatever he wants.
So I can see that, and then I think the most charitable interpretation, which I think is probably wrong, is that Trump is so wrapped up in his own ego that he doesn't want to give any light to the possibility that that the outcome of his election was anything but his own doing.
Right.
So if he concedes to this fact that the Russians meddled, then he's kind of conceding to the possibility that he wouldn't be president if the Russians didn't meddle, and that's just too much for his ego to handle.
There's like cognitive dissonance, basically.
Yeah.
So like on the one hand, he has the intelligence agencies telling him it was definitely Russia that meddled, and on the other hand, he's like, well, but it can't have been, because if that happened, then it was illegitimate that I won, and like I'm the best.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's your charitable interpretation.
That's the
your
most charitable.
Okay, well,
I mean, can you think of a better one?
Yes, yes. So their charitable interpretations exist. Trust me. So
that isn't like a 4D chess.
Well,
interpretation.
It goes into 4D chess territory, but there's a range there. So I would put what you just described with the ego point into like medium territory. I would say a reasonable charitable case is that he's just intentionally inconsistent with all of his messaging all the time. And that doesn't have to be, it could be part of a wider strategy. It could be that he just doesn't even really pay attention to what he says most of the time. He just says whatever makes sense to him in the moment. That kind of seems like what's happening here. And so even if you're not in a 4D chess scenario and you think that he's actually just like an idiot, just like moving through the world, he doesn't necessarily have to be ego driven. He could just be saying whatever makes sense to him at the time and trying not to like drown in the political morass that he finds himself in. Now, if anything, even at this Helsinki summit with Putin, maybe he just felt like awkward and he didn't want to say something that would be inappropriate around Putin, and he hadn't been properly advised on it or forgot the advice or something. I mean, it's really hard to say. So that's like I would say a medium charitable interpretation, or like a medium to more charitable interpretation is that he's just mildly incompetent, but not in like a motivated way. He's just an old man trying in a hard situation, you know. But I actually had a friend of mine who's slightly more Trump sympathetic had, I thought, a pretty good argument in favor of the maximum charitability here. So let me give this argument. Okay, so you're talking about this in our chat, and he says, so it occurs to me today that this is my friend, it occurs to me today that he spoke very glowingly of Xi Jinping, was very flattering in person, etc., but he's fucking China so hard right now. I see so few in media pointing out this obvious disparity. People also forget the juxtaposition of, quote, totally destroy North Korea, end quote, and Kim praising, which if outside of this conversation, you remember like a year ago, he had a lot of very antagonistic tweets against North Korea. But then when they met in person, he was he was praising Kim Jong-un quite a lot, and they were very amicable. So back to the quote. And yet now the media wants to interpret the conciliatory tone in news conference as being indicative of some durable, friendly stance towards Putin. Starting to feel like Scott Adams over here. Clearly, this is someone who is rarely sincere and tactically misrepresents his motives all the time. And yet we keep taking every utterance literally instead of focusing on the concrete details of what is happening on the ground. So for Russia, he points out, there have been 80 expelled Russian diplomats, greatly increased NATO military spending, direct attack on Putin client Assad, this is in Syria, perhaps with Russian casualties even, economic crippling of Russia ally Iran, oil exploration in ANWR, glutting global gas market that is a major source of Russian state revenue, pressure on Germany to stop buying Russian gas. And then he similarly points out with China and Xi Jinping, there's tariffs on Chinese goods, Chinese growth slowing. In North Korea, there's Trump has placed crippling sanctions and threats of total annihilation on them. So basically, my friend is pointing out that there's this semi-consistent pattern of Trump is cozying up to foreign authoritarian leaders and sort of stroking their ego whenever he meets with them in person. But then in terms of the actual foreign policy effect, he's very strong on all these various fronts on Russia, on Iran, on China, on North Korea.
So why?
So what do you think about that take?
Well, why is the only people he's cozying up to are the leaders of Russia, China, and North Korea? He's not cozying up to anybody else. He's not cozying up to EU leaders at the climate summits. He only cozies up to dictators. So what does he have to gain from only cozying up to them?
Well, the most charitable interpretation, if you assume that this is all intentional and strategic, which even if Trump isn't being strategic, at least reading out the logic, someone who wasn't Trump, who was strategic, you could see them, this is like a reasonable justification for the behavior. It doesn't necessarily make sense to go up to Putin and be like, yeah, you're an asshole and we're totally going to mess you up. Like, maybe it does make sense to seem like you're on his side. Or maybe it's something that there's some sort of value in the confusing mixed messages that you give so that people like can't predict your behavior or something like that. And part of the quote here is that this is a person who is rarely sincere and tactically misrepresents his motives all the time. So why would you assume that he wasn't doing this also with political enemies? So to your question about why he's not doing that with people like in the EU, for instance, or like leaders Theresa in like May. Canada. Yeah, exactly. So one argument there is that if he thinks that we've been not hard enough on our enemies, and that we've been too soft too cozy with our allies and like not powerful enough at negotiating, there could be some strategy there behind like, okay, we have to be hard on our enemies and we have to, impose these sanctions and take stronger foreign policy stances, but you don't necessarily want to show your hand to your enemy if that's what you're doing. You don't want to tell your enemy exactly what is going on. So you might want to represent them as though that you're on their side while you're secretly like messing them up. And that's actually kind of what Putin is doing in the reverse, because when Putin is asked, he's like, oh yeah, I'm totally, the US's best interest is in my heart as well. And I'm, doing the best that I can for you guys.
Okay, so the charitable the charitable reason here is that he's not behaving this way to our allies because that would tip his hand that he just behaves this way to everybody.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there's like the confusion element there. And then also the fact that what is the benefit of doing that with your allies? Because if he thinks that we are already too bullish on globalism or cooperation and that we like take those relationships for granted, it might make sense for him to dial that back a little bit and say, hey, by the way, we want to have some negotiating leverage in the Paris Climate Agreement or in NATO or in those sorts of deals where in the past people just sort of like smile and shake hands and be like, oh yeah, we'll totally just do whatever. And it doesn't really matter because as long as we appear cordial, people like the public is not going to question it. So I mean, I'm not fully buying into this 4D chess narrative, but I think that the facts on the ground, as my friend states it, are somewhat compelling. Like, I don't see any non-rhetorical ways in which like Russia or China or North Korea are benefiting from these meetings with Trump. It seems like the only ways that it appears that he's cozy with them is what he like literally says on TV. And Ben Sasse, a prominent Republican, a senator, has taken a very hard stance against Trump on this issue, and he said that an important aspect of our leadership is that they have to represent a strong face internationally, and they have to represent American values, and they have to publicly denounce the activities of dictators like Putin. And I'm sympathetic to that line, which is that you should have some sort of like principled leadership stance. Yeah. But I think if Trump is viewing his role, assuming that he's like actually a competent strategic actor, he might view his role as like, okay, I could be a leader in that way and sort of like reach across the aisle, and I could be sort of like Obama, but that's not my specialty. What I'm going to do is get the US a good deal. And I need to use the strategy that I've learned from my years of like messing up other real estate competitors or working with mafiosi in New York. And when you're working with these people, you can't do the traditional like mainstream media politic type stuff. Like you have to be strategic, and you have to make your people that you're negotiating with confused about what your actual intentions are, because the more knowledge that they have of what you're trying to do, the more that they can mess you up. And I think that given the evidence that we have of both Trump's behavior, who he is as a person, and what is actually happening in terms of real outcomes of foreign policy, that's actually all consistent. Like the charitable interpretation is actually consistent, which was surprising to me when this argument was laid out to me.
Yeah, there's nothing about it that I don't like, that I absolutely don't buy. But if I did buy all of it, this still isn't how I want the leader of our country to behave.
Fair enough.
I still want our president to, represent us as a citizenry and act honestly and say true things to the international community.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I'm going to choose between someone who is honorable and a strong leader and represents like Western liberal values, but slightly less effective in terms of actual policy, and then someone who is just like pure get the job done, like doesn't matter what it takes. I'm much more of a deontologist in this case. I'm not like a consequentialist. I wouldn't say that it's better off to have someone that just like plows through the institutions and does whatever he wants as long as the outcome is good in the short term.
Yeah.
But I think that there's at least an argument there for it. And I think if the charge is going to be, oh, Trump is just an idiot, or he really likes Putin, or he wants or colluded with Russia, or is compromising America in favor of foreign powers or something, I think that there is a strong argument against that. And I think that if that's the narrative being pushed, then people might be confused as to what sort of options we have, instead of the option being honorable but slightly less competent versus competent but dishonorable. That's one question. But the question is like idiot racist versus glorious progressive class hero or something. I don't think that it doesn't make sense to view the conflict that way, because I think that's how you're going to create a situation where you've got left Trump versus Trump, as opposed to principled, less effective on policy leader like Obama versus Trump.
So yeah, no matter how plausible this kind of interpretation is, we shouldn't we shouldn't normalize this kind of behavior. Do you have any other takes you want to bring up? I've got a really good one.
Okay, yeah, go for it.
Okay, so this is from prolific Twitter user Donald J. Trump, at real Donald Trump.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. This is the actual account. So this was posted this morning. I don't know if you've seen this yet.
I think I have, but go for it.
Yeah, 8:50 a.m. on the 24th of July. Trump says, "I'm very concerned that Russia will be fighting very hard to have an impact on the upcoming election. Based on the fact that no president has been tougher on Russia than me, they will be pushing very hard for the Democrats. They definitely don't want Trump."
Wow.
This is like almost maniacal genius in like the way this spin is constructed. Like,
it really is.
If anyone buys this, it's like the perfect puzzle piece to go into like the Alex Jonesian
like narrative, a conspiracy narrative. Yeah, I think that hearing a tweet like that, it's much harder for me to be convinced that Trump is incompetent, because that message seems like extremely carefully crafted to have a particular outcome, which is basically like framing the political conversation in a way that he's basically like judo flipping the allegations on him of election collusion or like illegitimacy of his presidency.
Yeah, like
and just like turning that on his opponents.
Yeah, like I've been forced to admit that I agree with the intelligence agencies. Okay, so how do I spin it from there?
Right.
Yeah, and so this is able to preserve that. We can preserve the Russia collusion narrative, but now all of Twitter has to freak out about whether like who Russia is going to be targeting now. Like he's just introduced this very specific conflict into the Overton window where it just did not exist before.
Yeah, I really hope that doesn't pick up as an idea, because that's just so absurd.
Yeah.
Like it's so self-contradictory.
So demonstrably wrong, yeah.
Yeah, like morally wrong, not just like literally wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say how Trump supporters for the most part are actually feeling right now, because I think there's a lot of different takes on Trump, right? Like some people view him as just purely being a hero of the people. Some people view him as this sort of like secret strategizing 4D chess like negotiator who is definitely not being honest, but is still acting in the service of America more broadly, and is just doing it from like outside of traditional like social or institutional norms. And then there's some people that are just like, well, he's the least bad of a bad situation, or he's the one who's going to like destroy the establishment the most. And that was just that's what I really didn't like before. So it's going to be interesting to see how people split in the next election cycle, because if somebody's stance was something like, if a voter's stance was something like, well, I thought the choice between Trump and Hillary was both really bad, but I chose Trump to destroy the establishment. Presumably, you wouldn't want, if you elected somebody to drain the swamp or to undermine the establishment, you wouldn't want them to get reelected, right? Wouldn't that kind of defeat the point? Wouldn't it just be like, okay, the wrecking ball came through, now let's get someone like that we actually want?
America's not great again. We got
yeah, it's not great yet again. Because presumably this time when it was great would have been when we had strong leadership, right? Like, wouldn't we count someone like, I mean, if you were a hardline conservative, wouldn't you count someone like Ronald Reagan or Abraham Lincoln or something as being the time when it was great, not like Nixon or...
Yeah, well, I mean, the beauty of that line is like, no matter who you are, you have some kind of nostalgia for the postcard America that you loved when you were a kid. And
how to associate that with Trump? That's like the strange part.
Well, I mean, like I've seen the take that like that's our kind of capitalist mindset that makes Trump appealing to us. Like Americans all see themselves as rich people, like future rich people.
You're temporarily embarrassed billionaire.
Yeah. That's the line. Who says that?
I don't remember.
Okay.
Well, I guess so. But then why would this have not ever been true in the actual past of America? Like like if you're hearkening back to, the 50s or the 70s or the 80s or something, we didn't really have presidents that were like Trump. Even the ones that were, famous from outside of politics, like Reagan or like Carter or something. It's not like they...
Well, I don't think anybody can make the case that this is very similar to another time in history. This is a totally unique time in American politics.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just saying that Trump doesn't even feel very nostalgic to me. Like, I would understand if they were supporting someone like, or if that message went along with someone like Romney, or someone who is just like a, or Ben Sass, who is very pro like traditional American values and speaks with like a strong, deep voice. And
I mean, I don't know if it's Trump himself,
like a nice haircut,
but like this line, "Make America Great Again," is this squishy thing that can kind of fit into whatever frame of nostalgia that you have personally.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I guess the idea is you wouldn't want to make America something that it is now because you don't like what it is now. And you wouldn't necessarily want to change it so much in the future, because if you are a fan of, the jobs that your parents or grandparents had, or if you like your town and you like the what you perceive as the like moral fabric or social fabric or something, you wouldn't want to be a progressive. Like this is how it's different than something like progressivism.
Yeah, well, change was literally Obama's slogan.
Right.
So, and then Trump is in large part a reactionary president.
Right. It's like change, but backwards to make things when they were good previously, like inverse change. It's not like make America great as like keep America great now, like maintain America's current greatness. That's not the slogan. Yeah, I don't know, man. I don't really know where we're even going with this, but yeah, I mean, that's quite a take.
There's not much left to say on Trump.
Do you think people have talked about him enough?
No. No. We can't let this normalize. We can't let this be politics as usual. Like on the one hand, I don't think we should be freaking out over every single Trump tweet, and we also shouldn't be dishonest about the things that Trump does. Like there's plenty terrible things he does to be honest about, that we don't need to use those kind of tactics. But yeah, we can't let this be the usual.
Yeah. I mean, I really hope that we can get to a point where we can have a president that we feel like really, truly and deeply supports American values, and that everybody can sort of agree and like point to that person and say like, yeah, this is an American. Yeah. This is the American president. This isn't like who 50% of the, populace supports because they're idiots, or that 50% opposes because they're, evil globalists or something. I mean, I think that Obama was that in my eyes for the most part, for, any of his flaws that other people have pointed out. And I think that you could point at him and say like, this is the guy that I would have him over.
Yeah. I mean, he certainly acted that way. Like his rhetoric was like for all the, the Fox News reporting during Obama's terms saying that he's like the most divisive person in history. Like we know that that's just wrong now.
Yeah. I mean, for that matter, I miss George Bush, to be honest, or George W.
Yeah.
Because I mean, at the very least, like, while everything was happening with 9/11 and near the end, the financial crisis, like that was a very chaotic time. And you could at least watch him on TV. And even if you didn't agree with, like, if you didn't agree with Republican politics, or even if you were an atheist, you could say like, okay, I'm okay with him representing what America is. Like,
yeah, I mean, at the very least, he wasn't intentionally divisive.
Yeah, and he wasn't, or he wasn't lying in order to like manipulate people to do what he wanted. If anything, he could be criticized for being like too sincere, or like too pure, and like not saying gaffes and not knowing everything about like not having a huge vocabulary or something. But anyway, it's like, it wasn't even that long ago, but it feels so long ago now. It feels like time has just stretched out during this presidency. And unfortunately, it seems quite likely at this point that he might get reelected.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing.
Yeah, I think the Democrats have got to offer somebody that is much more compelling than, or they either have to offer something that's more compelling than pure socialism, or they're going to win on pure socialism, and then that's its own concern. But maybe this is just the beginning of some sort of like center word drift. I don't know. It's hard to say.
Well, we're gonna have to, like, we have these party realignments every few decades, and it's just gonna have to be another one of those, but it's gonna have to be a different one than we've ever seen.
Yeah. There's this book that I can recommend. I don't know if we should, maybe we should start doing this on the pod or not, but there's this book that I read last year called The Once and Future Liberal by Mark Lilla that I thought was really good. It basically did what you said, where it talked about the history of the parties in the 20th century and how it sort of went from like FDR, Lyndon Johnson progressivism to like Reagan conservatism. And then now we're in this new phase of party realignment where we have to have a party that represents liberal values. Yeah. And if that's not going to be the individualist small government conservatives, if it's not going to be the progressive like socialist Democrats, and who's it going to be? And that's
well, I mean,
you have to figure out.
Like that it's necessary for that to be the case in our political system, because our political system only goes two directions, and actual political philosophy is 4-dimensional, right? Or 3-dimensional. There's like
dimensional.
there's 4 directions you can go in actual political philosophy. You can go up and down, authoritarian or non-authoritarian, and you can go progressive or conservative. And the reason this works with two parties is because we all kind of generally agree on how authoritarian we should be. And once we start disagreeing about that, our system doesn't have really a way to correct for that.
Well, let's hope it does.
Yeah. Yeah.
We'll play our part.
All right.
Is there anything else that we have?
No, I think that's it.
Okay, let's wrap it up.
All right. That was Grokking Points. Outro. Follow us on Twitter.
Just say outro and it'll happen.
Yeah.
Follow us on Twitter, follow our YouTube, follow our Instagram, where we'll post pictures of us just arguing with each other.
Yeah. Links in the description. All right. See you guys in a couple weeks.